All right, so first things first, I got most of your BLA assignments, which were all good. Your kind of continuation for this now is you're going to do the same thing, except now you have a $50 spending limit for the week. So same exact directions as last week, except now you only have 50 bucks. PowerPoints I have here for you, so we'll be covering lipids and proteins. I wanted to go over the Hunger in the Global Environment project with you here for a couple minutes. I changed the due date on the draft to being the 18th, so next week, not this week like it originally was. So this project originally was supposed to be kind of like the big CLC thing you did for the term. Sorry about that. But because you're not able to actually go and do what you're supposed to do for this, which is volunteer at an organization, we're going to be doing kind of a simulation of that. So this is kind of one of the good things where, you know, being split up does kind of help. What you're going to do here is that originally you're supposed to go volunteer in groups at some sort of food related organization. Like there's, like tons of people would go to say St. Vincent de Paul, St. Mary's Food Bank. Several went to like local farms like community farms that were donating like foods. But you go, you volunteer your time, you video it, you report back on it, and everyone's happy, right? Well, we're not actually having you go out and do that now because, you know, we're not really able to. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to research one of the organizations here. So here's a bunch of different ones. You don't have to exclusively pick one of these because you're not limited geographically. You know, the limits obviously were geographic because, you know, you can't go to somewhere that you can't go to, right? So what you'll be doing is instead of it says research 3 different organizations, I want you to research one organization. However, you can't pick the same one as your fellow classmates on your class day. So U4 plus ITSL can't pick the same one. So you'll need to email me or send me a forum message to get approval. And what you're going to do is just do kind of a deep dive into what they do, how you would volunteer, what people can do to get involved with this, who they affect, how much they affect them. So just a broad overview of this organization.
When we email you, you just want us to send you like a couple options that we're interested in, and then you could say like, oh, 2 of those are taken, but you can do that for everyone. Or...
Yeah, if you want to do that, that's fine. I would send them in order of preference, I guess. So pretty simple with that. Then when you get to this part, the whole, the plan of implementation, this would be written, I want you to write this from the perspective of a college student. So not like how can just anyone get involved, but how can you specifically as a college student get involved? This part E is the why you would get involved. And this after involvement part here is one of the ones or one of the parts that's going to be a little tricky because obviously you're not actually getting involved. So what you're going to do for part E here is you should write this after you've done all your research and then write it from the perspective of has my viewpoint changed after researching this organization. the video bit here, I'm not going to have you do really a video because the video portion was all about videoing your actual experience. But what you'll do is you'll present, hopefully with some sort of visual aids, your organization, and that'll be done sometime. Oh, here we go. So that'll be done for you guys on November 10th, for the Thursday class, November 12th. So that should give you plenty of time to research and do everything. You are going to turn in only 2 things. So you're going to turn in a draft. So the draft is what is due next Sunday. So Sunday the 18th. And this is a completion grade. So you either get full credit or you get no credit kind of thing. These don't have to be finished by any means, but you have to at least have even a rough outline of what you're gonna do. So what you need by next Sunday is you need to have approval for your organization, and then you need to say even just a couple sentences how you plan to go about researching this and doing the implementation portion of that. Does that kind of make sense? So that you'll turn in a final paper on this. All right, so you have the paper that you'll do. The video is your presentation. So that'll be what you do November 10th or 12th. And this fruit of the spirit evaluation, you're not really gonna do this because it's gonna be individual since there's so few of you. So you don't have to worry about this. You can just turn in, because this is still an assignment, so you can just turn it in saying, you know, you completed it. That's about all you have to say for it. You can't really, because the whole thing was evaluating your other group members. So if you don't have group members, you don't have anyone to evaluate, kind of thing. And presentation's only, 5 to 10 minutes. Don't make it anything too, terribly lengthy or anything like that. I've had very few, if any, problems with this project in the 3.5 years I've been teaching this class. Everyone that's actually done it has done it well. The only time that I gave someone a poor grade or a group a poor grade was when they didn't actually do their volunteer work that they needed to do. And again, you guys aren't going to be doing the volunteer work itself because you're not going out to do that for this time around. But that was the only time that it happened or that I gave a bad grade was when someone actually didn't do it. They did essentially they toured a building, like they toured somebody's building. That's not annoying or anything. Yeah, sorry to everyone listening on Zoom right now. So, any questions on that? Pretty straightforward. Oh, and one last thing. I'm not so concerned about reaching the 750 to 1,000 word count. What I would really appreciate is if you had section headers for each of these sections. So to give me a very clear, this is what I'm talking about portion of that. The more and more that I read like research papers or lengthy essays, the more I really, really appreciate section headers. So that is that. Let's see here, the presentation is 50 points. The rough draft is 10 points. The fruit of the spirit is 10 points. And then the paper itself is 55 points. So 55, 50, 10, and 10 is $1.25, so 12.5% of your grade. Means you can't even get a B+ if you don't do this. All right, quizzes were quite good. Class average was over an 87, 87%. So great job with that. All right, so this week and next week, we are going to be getting into topic 3, which is our proteins and lipids. So today we are going to hopefully get through most of this. So this will be chapters 5 and 6, I believe. Okay. We're talking about lipids. The colloquial term we'll use for that is fats. So fats and lipids, for all intents and purposes, you can think of it as the same thing. The major difference we have to make is when you have, say, fats versus fatty acids. Fatty acids are going to be component parts of fats, and then triglycerides are going to be another separate entity of that. Triglycerides are the fats that you have in your bloodstream. So this will make a lot more sense when we break each of these component parts down. But again, with fats, you're talking about, again, an organic molecule, so these are all carbon-based. You describe fats and fatty acids by how long they are. So you have typically short chain, medium chain, and long chain fats, or you'll see also the term, like say long or medium chain triglycerides. These just describe how many carbons are on it. The more carbons you have, the bigger, obviously, the molecule is, the more potential energy you have. Now, all fats are going to have 9 calories per gram. If you have, obviously, bigger fat molecules, you'll get less overall molecules per gram. The density is going to be higher. So it's still pound of bricks versus pound of feathers kind of thing. It's just, if I have a pound of bricks, I have a very small amount of bricks. If I have a pound of feathers, I have a ton of feathers. They still both weigh a pound, but the density of them's changed, so the amount of it changes.
How many grams did you say?
1.
How many calories per gram?
9. And there are roughly 30 grams in an ounce. From these two here, you need to remember. And the only difference here is this nice little N. So linoleic versus linolenic acid. These are commonly known as your omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. Linolenic is omega-6. Linoleic is omega-3. What makes these so beneficial for you is this right here. So the more unsaturated a fatty acid is, the better it is for you. This is why your omega fatty acids are so good for you. But if you look at where you find them, you know, how many of you are packing on, you know, the sunflower oil into your daily diet kind of thing? I mean, walnuts are great, but I don't see any of you, you know, using those as a staple of your diet. Where's the other place you're going to find fatty acids, especially your omega fatty acids? Very commonly.
Fish. Right?
Fish, right? I love eating fish. I would love to be a pescatarian. It'd be awesome. My wife hates fish, so I don't get to eat fish. I occasionally get to eat crab because she likes that. So most people aren't consuming enough of these. You'll get omega-6 fatty acids very readily. Those come in like even just regular animal meats. You get those all the time. The omega-3s are the ones that are hard to come by. Typically, when you're looking at getting omega-3s, this is one of the few times where most everyone would benefit from a supplement. So we'll talk about supplements more, especially when we get into like micronutrients and different diet and whatnot. But supplements are to supplement your diet. It's not meant to substitute for it. I mean, you don't absolutely have to have omega-3s to survive, but it's going to help make life a lot easier for you. And we'll see why in a little bit. So of like really all supplements, you know, omega-3s are actually one of the ones that are pretty well recommended because in a typical American diet does not get enough, especially omega-3 fatty acids. I've talked about this before already, so the different bonds you'll have in your fatty acids. Remember that the more carbon-carbon double bonds you have, the more unsaturated the fat is. The less carbon double bonds you have, the less saturated it is, the less unsaturated it is, the more saturated it is. If you have no carbon-carbon double bonds, you have a saturated fat. The whole reason why you're naming them like omega-3 or 6 is because of where the actual double bond is. So the methyl end, this CH3 is a methyl molecule, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This would be a omega-6 fatty acid. This here, 1, 2, 3 would be an omega-3 fatty acid. So that's really why you get an omega-3, 6, and there's omega-9s as well. So that's why you distinguish them, is because of where the actual double bond is. I should say where the first double bond is, because all omega fatty acids are polyunsaturated, meaning there's at least 2 carbon double bonds. All right, back to our nice chemical reactions here. So again, you will need to remember that you have a condensation reaction. Condensation reactions are needed to give us an actual triglyceride. We need the fatty acid forming the tails, glycerol to form the head. So remember when we talked about how a triglyceride is made, you have the head, which is glycerol, the three tails that are your fatty acids. That forms your triglyceride. These are formed through a condensation reaction. You pair glycerol plus fatty acid, and that equals triglyceride plus water. Just because water is a byproduct of this, do not confuse this with a hydrolysis reaction. Hydrolysis would equal 1 minus 2 plus water equals 3. Hydrolysis just happens when this reaction occurs in the presence of water. So don't confuse the condensation reaction of forming a triglyceride with a hydrolysis reaction just because water is a product. Hydrolysis is only going to happen when water is part of the process, not when it's part of the product. Simple enough? Now, here's why saturation or unsaturation kind of matters. It changes fundamentally the structure of the molecule. Anytime you get a double bond, it's going to cause a kink in the line. So if you had a saturated fat, it would be a straight chain, just like this. When it's unsaturated, you get these kinks out. Because you have that kink out, you have a lot more surface area, and that will make your unsaturated fats liquids at room temperature. Your saturated fats are going to be solid at room temperature. This is why you can, like, say, leave butter out on the table and it will always stay solid. It immediately gets softer, but butter won't melt unless you actually heat it up. At room temperature, saturated fats are always going to be solid. Unsaturated fats are going to be liquid. The only real exception to this is with coconut oil. Coconut oil is going to be liquid at room temperature, but it will contain saturated fats. Pretty much if you ever hear coconut, you should think unsaturated, or you should think saturated fats. Coconuts are the only plant that have saturated fats naturally occurring within them. All other plants, unsaturated. You can only have saturated fats typically in animals plus coconuts. And this just shows you different composition of these, so kind of more FYI. Hydrogenation. So we talked about this. Remember, when you look at a food label and you see that term hydrogenated, partially hydrogenated, complete hydrogenated, or if you see the term shortening, that means what?
Yeah, hydrogens.
But what does that actually mean for the food product? What does it contain then?
Hydrogen ions. Well,
Whenever you have a hydrogenated product, you are going to be having a trans fat. What'll happen with the trans fats when you create them is you create them synthetically. So trans fats are not found in nature. You will never find trans fats on their own. You have to make these. When you think of trans fats, what kind of properties do you think of? Like, just practically speaking. What do we use trans fats for? What kind of foods do you think you're going to find them in? Sure. Any kind of like junk type food. Well, when you think of a junk food, what are you thinking of in terms of like, say, its shelf life? Yeah. Trans fats are used as preservatives. They're going to go a long way for making a food last very long. When you think about, like, say, your all natural organic based foods, how long of a shelf life do those usually have? I mean, it's pretty limited. This is also why if you have, say, or if you go like, say, grocery shopping in the produce section even, and you look at organic versus non-organic produce, the organic produce will spoil typically a lot quicker because there's no preservatives with it. Stuff that is non-organic, don't confuse non-organic with inorganic, or inorganic is non-carbon based, but non-organic based foods will have some kind of preservative on them. It's not something that's harmful. It's not like you're adding trans fats to, your apples or something like that, but we'll use some sort of preservative to keep the shelf life longer. Typically, it's also going to make the foods bigger. That's why, like, if you ever grow, say, like right now I'm growing cantaloupes in my garden. I got, I think, like a dozen of them so far. And my biggest one is probably about that big. So, like, mini basketball size. Well, if you buy a cantaloupe in a store, how big are they? Yeah, those son of bitches are, you're looking at like a beach ball there kind of thing. Well, that's not natural kind of thing. I mean, yeah, you can sometimes get those to eke out a lot bigger, but that has to do a lot with, like, say, genetics and the absolute perfect environment kind of thing. For the most part, what you grow organically in your own garden is going to be a lot smaller than what you'll see in the grocery store, because they add, well, farmers will add different chemicals to make things grow bigger, grow faster, and stay fresher longer. Otherwise, it'd be virtually impossible to go from, the field to your shelf to in someone's home without losing the majority of all that to spoilage. It's very difficult. It's also why you can't, for example, say, take like the seeds of a non-organic apple, plant them, and expect to get an apple tree to grow. A lot of those are what are known as hybrids. So meaning you take like a particular species of fruits that you want to grow, you put them on a different root stock that's already established. You can grow it a lot quicker, but it's not true to type. Meaning that if you grow the seeds of that, you're not going to get the same fruit to come out. So that's your farming lesson for the day. Now, with trans fats, these are the worst things for you. Trans fats are going to act more closely to saturated fats than they will unsaturated. This shows you what full hydrogenation looks like. Full hydrogenation means that you have taken out all of the carbon-carbon double bonds in an unsaturated fat, and you have saturated them. You have added hydrogens to them to force them into being a saturated fat. This is the least common trans fat you'll see. More commonly, you will see that term partially hydrogenated. If it's partially hydrogenated, that would mean that, say, only one of these is taken out. Well, that leaves me with an unsaturated fat, right? So why is that bad? This is one of the examples of where something that's synthetic is very bad for you. It's bad because it's synthetic. And I know I've used the example before. I can't think of anything better. It's like marijuana versus spice. One is your naturally occurring product that arguably has medicinal qualities to it. The other one makes you turn into a zombie and eat people's faces off, kind of thing. Synthetic marijuana versus regular old marijuana. Trans fats versus even saturated fats. So remember with our guidelines, how much should we limit our saturated fat intake out of our daily caloric intake? So first off, what percentage of fat should be in our daily diet? (20 to 35%), very good. And of those, how much should be saturated fats? I mean, you got approximately a 1 in 20 chance to guess right. 10%. So no more than 10% of your fat intake should be from saturated fats. How much should be trans fats? So surprise, surprise, 0. The FDA says you should limit, I'm sorry, the USDA says you should limit all trans fat intakes to as little or none if possible. There is not a suggested amount that you should be intaking. And this just goes into what the difference is between cis and trans fats. So all that this is it says what side are you on, the double bond. So you're looking at the double bond and the hydrogens that make it up. If you have a cis fat, both hydrogens are on the same side. If you have a trans fat, they're on opposite sides. So nothing you really need to know, but it's stuff I like because it's chemistry. Okay, that's your basic overview of what fats compositionally look like. Now we get into this stuff called phospholipids. Well, phospho, meaning phosphorus or phosphorylated, lipids, meaning our fats. These are essentially your fats that can both mix in water and in fat, which is a particular good thing when you're talking about, say, different foods. It'll be terrible if you had ingredients for, say, foods that couldn't mix together. We talked about, like, say, oil and vinegar. Like if you make Italian dressing, like salad dressing, you mix typically a red wine vinegar, olive oil, or some other vegetable oil, and like a herb kind of mix in there. And you shake it up and it's nice and mixed together. But if you let it sit, those separate, the oil and the vinegar separate, and you have to shake it again for it to remix. Well, imagine if that was, say, your actual, like, say, solid foods that did that they actually separated. One thing you can do to see how that actually works is if you ever have, like, say, chicken wings with sauce on them, and then put them in the fridge overnight, and you will see how the fats, especially the saturated fats, will separate out from the sauce. They'll be like gelatinous almost. It's kind of disgusting. So if you're going to save wings, you want to kind of make sure the drier they are, the better. So you definitely don't want to be leaving them in, you know, a pool of their own sauce there, because it will turn pretty disgusting on you. And that's because the saturated fats are coming out. Saturated fats, again, are solid at room temperature, so when they cool down, they are going to solidify. With a phospholipid, you have this glycerol head and the fatty acid tail, and they always line up like this. So the tails face each other, the heads face away from each other. This is what makes up our cell membranes. We don't have cell walls. We're not like plants. So our cell membranes are made to be permeable. Even though this is, you know, an airtight bond we have here, you can still allow things to pass through or diffuse through. What you can't let go through is, like, say, water or other liquids. You can't let that go through freely, because then that's going to cause the cell to swell up and burst. Not a good thing. So inside here, fats or fatty acids are hydrophobic, meaning they don't like water, they repel water. Glycerol is hydrophilic, meaning it accepts water, so it would mix in with water. So this is why you have all the tails facing each other, the heads on opposite ends, because the tails are going to push water away from the surface. They're going to keep everything inside the cell it's supposed to stay in, keep everything outside the cell it's supposed to stay out, but they allow for things to pass through as long as they have a transporter. So if the bouncer lets you in, you get in the club. If the bouncer says this is a fake ID, he kicks you to the curb, right? Sterols. The most important ones we have here are cholesterol. Sterols are a term for a bunch of different lipids. They do have the same suffix as alcohols, but they do not share the same properties at all. So I can't just say, you know, suffix OLS or OL means sterol, because that's not entirely true. However, like if you look at, say, the suffix ACE, that's always an enzyme kind of thing. So sterols we make in the body, they have a number of different roles. Primarily, what they're going to be doing here is they're going to be forming that cell membrane. So they're the ones that make up those phospholipids, which is really good. We need them. Now, you do have dietary cholesterol that you consume. You're typically going to find that in, like, animal products again. Shellfish have a surprisingly high amount of dietary cholesterol. So, like, if you look at, say, shrimps, shrimp will have a bunch of dietary cholesterol, but, like, say, no fat in them. And the recommendations for dietary cholesterol kind of keep switching. It used to be under 300 milligrams a day. Then it, like, changed to, well, you can have them as much as you want because they interact with the body differently than the cholesterol you produce. So don't be worried so much about, like, say, dietary cholesterols. I want you to be focused more on the actual cholesterol our body synthesizes. And I'm going to jump to this real quick. So this gets into what cholesterol is or does for us in our body and how it's actually structured. Cholesterol is a type of lipoprotein, meaning that is a mix of lipid and it's a mix of protein. So cholesterol or sterols are a mix there of both. The 5 different components you have are chylomicrons, VLDL, IDL, LDL, HDL. That's a whole lot. I probably should have these in order of, like, say, smallest to, actually, no, I do have an order of smallest to biggest, or biggest to smallest. Chylomicrons are your biggest lipoproteins. HDL, or high density lipoproteins, are your smallest lipoproteins. When you get, say, your cholesterol levels checked, the 2 things that are being checked primarily are these right here, HDL and LDL. IDL is your intermediate density. VLDL is very low density. And then chylomicrons are the lowest of densities. Chylomicrons, though, have a majority of triglycerides. They typically, the more dense you get, the worse it is for you. But chylomicrons are an exception because their density is due to triglycerides, not due to cholesterol. So what I want you to remember, though, is LDL and HDL. LDL, low density lipoproteins, HDL, high density lipoproteins. HDL is good, LDL is bad. If you look at the composition of these, LDL, HDL, purple here is proteins, and the orange there is your cholesterol. Those are the 2 most important parts of this. The more cholesterol you have, the more dangerous it is to you. The less cholesterol you have, the less dangerous it is to you. If you, in this little subset tells you here that there's 7 different subsets of LDLs, but the smaller the ones are, the worse they are, because the smaller they are, the higher the percentage is of cholesterol in them. So you don't have to worry about every single one of those. Just know, LDL, high cholesterol, low protein. HDL, low cholesterol, high protein. Now, when we get into how these actually affect our diet, or affect our health for that matter, we consume as Americans too much saturated fats, which is not the greatest thing in the world. If you consume lots of saturated fats and lots of trans fats, what's going to happen to your blood lipid profile? Well, that is going to increase your LDL, that is going to decrease your HDL. Your LDL is going to block your arteries. Your HDL is going to clean those arteries out. Reasons to say that you want to limit LDL production, you want to encourage or improve HDL production. Unless you have amazing genetics or you are on some sort of medication, your LDL production is always going to be greater than your HDL production, always. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just kind of the way it is. The more you have HDL, the more it's going, the more you have LDL, the more it's going to promote blood clotting. this is where the bad stuff happens. You don't typically clog an artery 100% with just cholesterol. What'll happen is that you'll clog it somewhat, and then a piece of this plaque will rupture off. So like it'll break off into the bloodstream. Well, because LDL is going to promote blood clotting, that's going to clot in your actual artery. And you see how that's a bad thing. Clotting, very good when you have an open wound. Very bad when you don't have a wound. When your body views stuff inside of it as bad, and it has an immune response, that's usually not the best thing in the world. So this clogs up now, and now you see how little space I actually have in here. You can have a heart attack if you have a relatively low amount of blockage. Like if you have less than 75% blockage, you can have a heart attack. You can't get, like, say, a stent put in unless you have over, I believe it's 79% blockage. So your body kind of overreacts a lot. And if you think about it, if you are, say, breathing out of a straw and your nose is plugged, and you start running, your breathing is going to increase, right? Because you need more oxygen. But you're breathing out of a straw, so you can't get much oxygen in there. How does that make you feel? Yeah. You know, hopefully none of you ever have a drowning or near drowning incident. But if someone's drowning, are they acting rationally? That's why for all you lifeguards out there, when you do any sort of lifeguard training, they will tell you when somebody is panicking in the water, you stay away from them because they will try to bring you down. And it's because they are acting animalistically, self-preservation. You are in a literal life or death situation. You're going to do everything you can to stay above water. It doesn't matter if it means taking down the person trying to save you, kind of thing. Natural instinct. So when that kind of thing happens, our body overreacts and it essentially closes off that oxygen flow when it may have the means to not do so. And there lies where you get your heart attack from. Lipid digestion, main thing with this, remember that you are going to digest lipids for the most part in the small intestine. We've already talked about CCK and all that good stuff. Fats are hydrophobic. So meaning, if you didn't have an enzyme to act on fats, it wouldn't be able to be absorbed through our small intestine well. We'll talk about a dietary supplement called orlistat, or you may know it as Ally. What that does is it blocks the absorption of fats. So you can actually get roughly 30% reduction in fat absorption through the digestive process because that will actually inhibit fat enzymes from acting on fats, meaning it won't allow them to be absorbed. Now, the downside to that is if I'm not absorbing fats in my intestines, I'm essentially going to be pooping out butter. So, you know, pluses and minuses. All right, emulsification of fat by bile. This is how bile actually bonds together our fats into the rest of our food stuff. So like I said, fat is hydrophobic. It will not mix with water. So you take this all here, this whole is our gastric juices. This is fat. These are enzymes. And the enzymes are released by the bile. Bile will go attached to your fats, allows fat to attach to enzymes, which will then allow it to mix with water. So in short, bile is an emulsifier. It will emulsify virtually everything. You can imagine if you didn't have a gallbladder, how much more difficult it would be to emulsify fats. Because remember, gallbladders where you store your bile, liver is where you produce it. You can still directly send bile from the liver to the intestines, but it's not going to give you nearly as much. So fat emulsification is going to be a lot more difficult when you do this. If you get your gallbladder removed, typically you are a lot more inefficient at how you are absorbing nutrients. So you tend to need to overeat to make up for a lack of nutrient absorption. All right, hydrolysis of a triglyceride, pretty self-explanatory. Add water to a triglyceride. It breaks it down into your glycerol head and your fatty acid tails. And this just shows you the circulation we have of bile. Lipid absorption. Remember this. Even though triglycerides are the fat we find in our bloodstream, they're too big to diffuse into our capillaries. So you can't just say, take triglycerides from the intestines and throw them in your bloodstream. It's too big. What you do is you get these micelles. And micelles work by getting released in the intestines. They are going to take on these short chain fatty acids. They're going to help bring them through into the bloodstream. And then they're going to reassemble those short chain fatty acids back into triglycerides. And here is where our nice friends, the chylomicrons, come back into play, because they're the ones that are the transporters. Chylomicrons are huge. They're like a bus. They're the party bus. And the only two people out on there are micelles and short chain fatty acids. So you see how they have this term here, monoglyceride? The micelle is going to take a monoglyceride. It will pair those together with others, send it into the chylomicron, where it's reassembled then into a triglyceride into our bloodstream. All right, talked about sizes already. In this bit here, lipid transport via the lipoproteins. So this is just telling you that cholesterol helps to transport lipids. Pretty straightforward. One thing with this here is you notice how fat cells are circular. Fat cells don't completely go away. They get smaller or bigger. Fat cells are like you yourself wearing clothes. The more clothes you put on, the bigger you are. The less clothes you have on, the smaller you are. If you take off all your clothes, you don't disappear. You're still a person. You're still there, fundamentally. Probably don't want to go out in public like that, though. but you never completely go away. The only way you go away is if you get, like, say, liposuction or that cool sculpting kind of thing. Those will work because they actually take out the whole cell itself. One of the things we'll talk about later on is where the fat actually goes. Okay, we've talked about triglycerides and all that and whatnot. Now we get into how much we should have of these. For triglycerides, you should have under 150 of these in a cholesterol reading or a lipid panel reading. 150, and that's milligrams per deciliter. So milligrams of triglyceride per deciliter of blood. Ideally, your ideal number is under 100. Your triglycerides, like I said, are the fats that circulate in your bloodstream. So what happens after I eat to my triglycerides?
What was the question?
What would happen to my triglycerides after I eat? They increase. Why? So remember, just from even the last slide there, I have those chylomicrons in the micelles that are reassembling my monoglycerides into triglycerides. You don't have adipose tissue just floating around in your bloodstream. That would be horrible. You have the triglycerides. So all fats that you absorb from your food then will immediately enter the bloodstream as triglycerides. So if you had a really fatty meal and you got your cholesterol checked like immediately after, probably like another hour or so after that, you can actually look like you have, you know, a cholesterol problem, like hyperlipidemia, just because of that. So you can't ever get your true blood cholesterol levels unless you're fasting. Cholesterol is the most sensitive to your food or diet. I should real quick distinguish between diet and meals. Your diet is the whole sum, whereas a meal is an individual eating session. So when you're talking about changing your diet, you're talking about changing everything. If you are talking about changing a meal, you're talking about one individual meal. All right, talked about this already. All right, our essential fatty acids. So we talked about the difference here between linoleic and linolenic. Linolenic fatty acids or omega-3 fatty acids are the least commonly found in our diet. Usually they're going to be something that if you want to get really optimal levels of them, you want to have some sort of foods or some sort of supplement to that. DHA and EPA. These are both types of polyunsaturated fats. I'm sorry, they're actually proteins that are then able to be converted into polyunsaturated fats. You take, for example, DHA, and what that'll do is that is going to take those out of this. So you can get omega-3 fatty acids from omega-6s, but it takes some doing. What you should remember is that, or you should remember these two here, And then again, the differences between these two names. These eicosanoids, this is just a hormone-like substance. Don't have to worry, you don't really have to worry so much about these, but it's just something to kind of keep in mind because these are going to help us with, say, getting or keeping our omega fatty acid homeostasis in check. All right, cancer and obesity. Any of you remember Rob Ford, the Toronto mayor? Sad. Well, he was the very large mayor several years ago, admitted to, say, smoking crack while in office. He ended up dying from a rare form of fat cancer. Like he actually got cancer of his fat cells. Very rare, but it can happen. We all know that obesity is not good health-wise. This is why I have very, very mixed feelings on, like, say, body positivity, because from a social standpoint, I see it as a very beneficial thing because mental health is very largely affected by that. And if you have good mental health, you have better overall health outcomes. But at the same time, physiologically speaking, if you're obese, it sets you up for a plethora of problems. So that's why, from a social standpoint, I see a lot of benefits to body positivity. From a strictly physiological standpoint, I see a lot of terrible things that come from it. So it's very difficult to say one way or another what's better, because let's say you correct your obesity problem at the expense of mental health. You know, what good is that going to do? Versus if you correct mental health at the expense of maintaining obesity. Neither of them give you an ideal outcome. If you go into medicine, you'll hear the term risk mitigation a whole lot. And it just essentially means that you're trying to not necessarily solve the problem, but make it a little bit better. So, for example, if I wanted to quit smoking cigarettes and I started vaping, we know that both are bad, but vaping's a little bit better in the grand scheme of things. So, risk mitigation. Okay, I'm not willing to quit completely, but I'm at least willing to step it down. Not ideal, but it works a little bit, right? With obesity, you carry a whole lot of risk for a number of different diseases and complications. The biggest problems with obesity come with blood glucose sensitivity, with your potential for myocardial infarctions or a heart attack, and with stroke. All of those are going to essentially be tied back into how clogged your arteries get or what's actually in those arteries. But the thing you don't really think about so much, but it does make sense, is that the more fat you have on your body, the higher your risk of many different cancers actually is. Not just cancer of your adipose tissue, but actual cancer of different body systems. So the more types, or the higher the risk you have, the more likely you are to get it. Now, I put this in here specifically because these risk factors are ways that promote cancer. They don't necessarily cause it. If I'm obese, it doesn't guarantee me cancer. Whereas if I inhale asbestos, it guarantees me that I'll get, Oh gosh, why am I forgetting the name now? Do you or one of your loved ones suffer from mesothelioma? There we go. Thank you. Yes, if you inhale asbestos, guaranteed get mesothelioma. Now, it could take, 20, 40 years for it to happen, but you are guaranteed to get it. If you're obese, you're not guaranteed to get cancer, but it does increase your chances to have it. This is where a lot of people get a very poor understanding of the mechanics of diet versus fat. Fats themselves are not bad, especially when you talk about your polyunsaturated fats, your monounsaturated, any unsaturated fats, those aren't bad. When you're talking about obesity, largely speaking, you're talking about an excess of overall caloric intake. You cannot gain weight unless you consume more calories than you burn. Just simple math. If my metabolism and all my activity and everything burns 2,000 calories in a day, I cannot gain weight unless I consume more than 2,000 calories a day. The whole principle behind so many 80s and even early mid 90s diets was if I cut out fats, I'm going to get skinny. And it just showed a very gross misunderstanding of how our body actually absorbs and uses nutrients, especially macronutrients. This is also why there is a lot of pushback with, say, a ketogenic diet, because ketogenic diet is high fat, very high fat, moderate protein, very low carbs. Just having a diet high in fats is not bad for you. If you have a diet high in saturated fats, on the other hand, that is bad for you, because saturated fats will promote LDL cholesterol production, and those will clog your arteries. The way that you control LDL cholesterol is largely through your diet. The way you control HDL cholesterol is largely through exercise, specifically cardiovascular exercise for long periods. Consuming omega-3 fatty acids can assist with helping HDL production, but it's not foolproof. There's a number of different medications that are used for controlling LDL cholesterol. They all fit in typically in the statin family. We'll talk about those a little bit later. But what you should just know is that the more adipose tissue you have, the higher your risk of many different cancers. Okay, one of my favorite diets, the atherogenic diet. Athero, referring to your arteries, genic, meaning an increase. What do you think that this diet here is telling you to do? Not so much. Maybe. But what if I just want to eat kale chips and rice cakes? What do all these foods share in common?
Salt.
And what kind of fat? Saturated, there you go. Yes, while many of these probably will have trans fats in them, they are going to all carry the same two general items with them. And that is sodium and saturated fats. You pair that with a high amount of calories and you're in trouble. Sodium is an electrolyte. What does sodium do? Fluid retention, yes. Where salt goes, water follows. So if I consume high amounts of salt, what is that going to do to my fluid homeostasis? No. Opposite. If I consume a diet high in sodium, I'm going to retain fluids. This is not a good thing when you talk about your heart, because the more fluids I have, the more overall volume of stuff I have in my bloodstream, the harder it makes my heart work. Sodium will also act to increase your blood pressure. So double whammy there. Saturated fats we've already talked about. So saturated fats, you're talking about primarily increase in LDL production. They also are going to more readily turn into storage or adipose tissue. So needless to say, you want to kind of avoid this diet. And there you go. Now, atherosclerosis, this is just where we get the hardening of our arteries. Have you all had anatomy? And I know you do human cadavers here. Did any of your cadavers have atherosclerosis that you know of?
Well, if you're nursing, you can't look at cadavers. We have to look at like.
Really?
Yeah, I know it just changed like last year. Yeah.
Why is that?
I think when I asked, they said that there just wasn't. I think they said there just wasn't enough cadavers. So they just prioritize like med students instead or something like that.
Oh.
You could, like, if you went into like the anatomy help like tutoring, they would have cadavers there, but sometimes you could look at. But
That's, well, that's kind of, yeah, I feel cheated there. I mean, I only got a cat, and, you know, what was terrible about it, I got just like a whole frozen cat. So I had to skin the thing. I mean, like, okay, my grandpa's a hunter, so I mean, I kind of know a little bit of my way around a dead body. But still, I mean, when you're trying to slice open, you know, frozen fur with a tiny little 10 blade, I mean, it makes things a little bit difficult there. But yeah, anyway. If you were to feel, especially a bigger artery, like say your descending aorta that has atherosclerosis, and you actually like palpate it, it'll feel like a potato chip. Like it'll actually crunch, like you can hear it crunch. You don't think of potato chips as something that are structurally sound kind of things, you know? And this here is what I was talking about. When you get a rupture in that plaque wall, it sends out plaque into the artery, which then gets clotted. And you see how little room I have here left for actual circulation. After you turn around about 18, you start getting clogged arteries. Everyone does. This is perfectly normal. So once you reach adulthood, your arteries start collecting junk. It just happens. The speed and the amount at which that junk collects is largely dependent on you. Now, yes, there are many genetic factors that go into it. So like if you are someone that's of an African or Asian descent, you're much more likely to have higher levels of, or higher blood cholesterol levels than someone of, say, like a Caucasian descent or European descent. But largely, your own food and activity choices, or lack thereof, are going to be bigger components with that. Now, what's happening here? You're getting these plaques, and they don't just say, you know, clog up like a pool noodle kind of thing. It's not like you just stick them into a pool noodle and you can just like blow them out kind of thing. What's actually happening is these are embedding themselves into the artery wall itself. And that's why you can't just go and say scrape it all out kind of thing. There's, at least one product I've seen that is being used for peripheral artery disease that actually does do that, but it's only able to scoop out a certain percentage of, or a certain depth of those buildups. You can't just take it all out. If you did that, you would tear the artery wall. So because this grows or embeds in there, it makes it very difficult to get out. If this clogs up, you have usually, like say, a balloon angioplasty, or you get a stent put in place. Both of those are going to just push or compress up the plaques against the walls like a trash compactor. Doesn't actually get rid of it, it just opens up that space. You can only do that so much before you need, like, say, a full-on bypass. Now, the more you have a blockage in arteries, especially your coronary arteries, the more likely you're going to have hypertension and hyperlipidemia. So HTN, hypertension is high blood pressure, HLP, hyperlipidemia, or high cholesterol. C-reactive protein, CRP, this is going to be my major indicator of bad things. You don't get things going wrong in your body unless C-reactive protein is present. C-reactive protein is an inflammation indicator. And again, just like I was saying with blood clotting, very good when you have an open wound, terrible when you don't. Inflammation, great when you have an injury, terrible if you don't have an injury. If you sprain your ankle and your ankle swells up, what does it look like? It's like you got a baseball on where your ankle should be, right? Well, why does your ankle swell? Like, what's the whole point of, if you get injured, why does that part of your body swell up? Partly.
Increased blood flow there in general.
Decreased blood flow.
Really?
You are trying to stabilize that. So you're trying to prevent any more damage from being done. That's why, like, if you say were to injure a body part near a major artery, you could very easily pass out because it can cut off blood circulation temporarily. Well, you'll probably not be able to see this, but I'll try to show you anyway. So this here is my arm. Nice big bruise there. And if you can tell, you can kind of see the actual baseball that did that to me. Well, what had happened was I was pitching, and this was from August 2013. So I was pitching, and I remember the exact guy I was facing. He was left-handed, I'm a right-handed pitcher. I threw him a two-seam fastball, which is going to tail away from the lefty. He tried to pull it, so he tried to hit it down the first base line. With that ball going away, him trying to swing that way, the ball went up the middle. I threw it, and the ball came like right here. I naturally recoiled to try to catch it with my bare hand, because why not? And it nailed me square in the forearm here. Of course, I was down writhing in pain because I had never felt that kind of pain before. And the one of the players' wives said that it sounded like the bat hit the ball twice. Is what the sound was like. Luckily, I only had a hairline fracture to my radius there, so that was great. Lucked out that way, I guess. After that initial pain was over, I had it was really swollen there. And I actually ended up passing out in the dugout because it cut off circulation to my radial artery. So That happened because of inflammation. You need that inflammation because it's going to help stabilize that area to help prevent you from getting further injured. That's good. I want inflammation then. However, if I was not injured and my arm started swelling up, would that be a good thing? No, not at all. That's telling me that my body's trying to fight off something inside. With C-reactive protein, that's saying essentially that there is inflammation in your blood vessels. The more C-reactive protein you have, the more likely you are to have a stroke or heart attack. So I forget what the actual number is, but once you reach a certain cutoff point, it's kind of like a guarantee that you're gonna have one or the other. So when you see C-reactive protein increase, that is usually a bad sign when there's no other acute injury to pair with it. All right, talked about all this. All right, saturated versus, or cutting fat calories from saturated fats. So remember that your saturated fats are gonna be solid room temperature. When you have, like, say, a cut of meat that has fats in it, those are all gonna be saturated fats. Now, they aren't going to just say liquefy when you cook them because of their relative location and their kind of density of that. But trying to make sure you don't eat all that, great. Baked potato, try using it without butter, awesome. With milk, I mean, of all things, if you're going to try to be getting rid of saturated fats, milk's probably the least, likely culprit you're gonna have. Your biggest culprit is going to be your animal meats and your junk foods. Yeah, I mean, pretty much you're not going to have a whole heck of a lot of saturated fats in anything else. Again, like maybe your coconut-based products. But yeah, that's really about it. So when you're trying to cut down on fats, your big thing you should cut down on are your saturated fats. That's kind of the moral of the story here. All right, these just show you a nice good meal comparison here. The whole salmon and salad with, or salmon and broccoli with ranch dressing or something like that, versus a steak. Do any of you have actually put butter on your broccoli? I'm sure people do, but I would never think of doing that. But anyway, what the point is here is that it's showing that these are equal caloric meals, but the fat profile is a lot different. I mean, first off, you're kind of cheating. So you're taking salmon versus like beef, and no matter what you do, virtually every single piece of fish is going to be healthier for you than any sort of land animal, for the most part. I mean, if you look like boneless, skinless turkey breast or boneless, skinless like turkey or chicken breast or something like that, I mean, those are going to be pretty good for you. Because most of the fats in those are going to be in different body parts or directly under the skin. But the point is here is that not all calories are treated the same, or not all calories are created equally. The more saturated fats you have, the worse off you are. So the book wants to tell you this in about 500 different ways. And we've already talked about food labeling. Remember that with trans fats, you can say 0 grams if you have up to 0.5 grams per serving And remember the words you're looking for. Actually not in here. No, it's not. So at least you don't have any trans fats in those. But again, remember, hydrogenated is that term you're going to look for trans fats. When you break down fats, you have to break them down into your component parts. So on a food label, you have to show your saturated, your unsaturated, and your trans fats. You don't have to put trans fats on there if there truly are no trans fats. So if you don't have even anything that would be a trans fat, you don't have to include it then. You have to include everything that's in the food. So even if there is this half gram or less of trans fats or half gram or less of anything, you still have to include that word on there. You can still put the 0 grams, but you still have to include that in there because you're showing that there is something in there. Now, fat replacers, or these different kinds of, like, say, low-calorie stuff. You think of, say, like butter versus, I can't believe it's not butter. What's different about those, other than obviously the nutritional content? I mean, yeah, you got all the different stuff in here. So like for butter, you'll see how this is cream and salt, and it's just mixed all together. Whereas this non-dairy spread has all this stuff in there. Some of this is really good. I mean, if you look in here, vitamin D, vitamin E, lactic acid, beta-carotene, potassium, calcium. That's all good stuff, right? So more ingredients doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Can you tell a difference between the two?
You mean taste?
Yeah. I mean, I never really could. But my wife swears that she can. So I only get to use butter now. And it's not a terribly big trade-off. So if you look here, 80 calories versus 100 calories, 2.5 grams of saturated fat versus 7 grams of saturated fat. Yeah, I mean, getting a few more grams of it, I mean, it's not going to break the bank, but you also don't want to be loading up on that stuff. It's kind of the same thing you would have between a full calorie drink and a diet drink, or like a full calorie pop and a diet pop. All of these things are generally recognized as safe. So meaning there's no known adverse effects with them. But it's not to say that there isn't a possible negative side effect out there. Again, everything in moderation. And truthfully, if one tastes better to you than another, you know, you're going to be okay either way. Just don't use the whole bottle or the whole stick. All right, here's what I was telling you about with the HDL versus LDL. So LDL clogs your arteries, HDL gets rid of them. Pretty simple there. All right, heart disease. This is fun. You have two classes of risk factors for heart disease, modifiable and non-modifiable. Non-modifiable are the things you can't change. You can't change your biologic sex. You can't change your age, your family history, or your ethnic or racial status. All those you are born with, you are stuck with. The older you get, the worse off things are. So when you get into advanced age, everything breaks a lot more easily, right? If you are a female, sorry ladies, but you are at higher risk of heart disease just because you're a female. Que lastima. Ethnic and racial status, we talked about that already. Like say, for example, if you come from an Asian or African genealogy, you're at higher risk of having heart disease. All those are non-modifiable. And the family history is only important for your immediate parent. So in something like cancer, cancer runs through generations, whereas heart disease is typically single generation kind of stuff. So if your mom or dad had a history of premature or early onset heart disease, for mom, it would be under age 50, for dad, under age 55. That would be a risk factor for you. The things that you can control are your modifiable risk factors: smoking, exercise, diet, physical environment. The environment itself is going to be like the actual, like what's your climate outside kind of thing. Phoenix isn't all that great because we tend to have a little bit higher levels of pollution. I mean, we're not, Beijing or anything like that, thankfully, where, the smog is so thick you can't see the skyline kind of thing. But the more you have that, and especially ground level ozone is the big pollutant to worry about, those can actually cause a plethora of health problems. I talked about all these. These are your statins. These are your OR medications. So a medication that ends in OR is typically going to be a statin. Statins are your lipid lowering medications. Primarily, they're meant to target LDL, but they will also lower HDL. It's important to be taking some sort of like a fish oil or omega-3 supplement if you're on a statin to help try to counteract the lowering of your HDL cholesterol. Statins are one of the best in-class medications in terms of, say, preventing premature death from heart disease, but they do carry side effects with them. There is like muscle and joint pain that can be associated with them. There are some long-term potential negative side effects, but for the most part, the positives greatly outweigh the potential drawbacks to them. This here is showing you what a blockage is going to look like. So you can see in these darker colored sections, these are actually blockages here in these coronary arteries. You've got three primary coronary arteries. You've got a left, a right, and a circumflex. The left coronary artery is your most important one. Why? What's on the left side of your heart? Your left ventricle, that's right. And what does your left ventricle do? To where?
The body.
The body, yes. And surprise, surprise, your left coronary artery supplies blood to your left ventricle. If that one goes down, you no longer pump blood to your body. If you don't pump blood to your body, you die. That is why if you have a heart attack or a blockage of your left coronary artery, it is called a widowmaker heart attack. One thing that you nurses will, I'm sure, need to know, at least in the future, are the standards for ER admittance for cath lab admission. So if somebody comes in with a suspected or a confirmed heart attack, you have 90 minutes to go from door to table. If it's a 100% blockage in the LCA, or your left coronary artery, you may have as little as 10 minutes to provide an intervention before irreparable heart damage or death occurs. When you have a heart attack, all it's happening is you're cutting off blood supply from a particular area of the heart, so the heart starts dying. That's just all that happens. No big deals. All right. I want to finish up here with two types of diets. The two named diets that are best for our heart health are Mediterranean and DASH. I seem to have cut off my DASH diet, but that's okay. The DASH diet is from the American Heart Association. It stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. Or much easier to say, DASH. The whole gist of the DASH diet is low sodium. That is the number one thing you have there. You want low sodium and you want to have low saturated fats. You do those two things and it's very likely that you are going to reduce your chances of having hypertension. The Mediterranean diet, on the other hand, is primarily used for cholesterol control. If you look at the Mediterranean diet, it is very low in saturated fats, no trans fats, very liberal use of olive oil. So especially like your extra virgin olive oil, that is the crux of what you should be using for oils, fats in your diet for this. And then you want to have essentially a plant-based diet. In terms of the proteins you eat, fish and seafood are your major ones there. You want to limit animal meat. So primarily, you're going to want to limit, like say your beef, your pork, there you go. Red meats primarily are the ones you want to get rid of. So poultry's good, but that goes with, again, that whole boneless, skinless chicken or boneless, skinless turkey, because immediately underneath the skin is where you have most of your fats located. It's also why it tastes the best when it has the skin on. Oh, I have it down here. Now, we talked about fiber a lot last week. One of the other things that I didn't mention with fiber that I was waiting for this week to mention was fiber's role in cholesterol control. So remember that fiber is going to act as a bulking agent. When it comes to cholesterol, what fiber does is it is going to kind of trap fats a lot more, and it's going to cause much more cholesterol turnover. So it essentially is going to make cholesterol break down into its component parts more so than if it wasn't there. So that's the role that fiber plays with cholesterol control. This is also why if you have high cholesterol, you want to evaluate your fiber intake, because most likely you're not getting enough fiber. If you wanted to try to control your cholesterol naturally, you would want to increase your amount of like say fish that you eat, you would want to obviously decrease your saturated fats. You would want to increase your fiber intake, and then you would want to increase your intake of naturally occurring statins. So the #1 food that naturally contains statins are your red yeast rice. That is going to be the highest amount of statin naturally that you would have. Also things that are higher in niacin, or is it vitamin B6? I think it's B6. All right, that's going to bother me. Hold on. B3. But yeah, those are going to be the main things that are going to help naturally reduce your LDL and improve your HDL. All right, so we are pretty much at time there. So that is perfect. That's everything new I had for you here today. What kind of questions do you all have? Awesome. Well, if you don't have any more questions, you guys are all set. And then I will see you all next Tuesday.
I'll get you that thing. It should be by tonight.
Okay.